Good morning, everybody. Thank you. As kids, we were told that the United States was the exemplar of democracy. And I think it's sobering to discover how we fall short. At our founding, only white property men could vote. Senators were elected not by the people, but by state legislators. And unlike some countries like Canada and Germany, there was no affirmative right to vote in our Constitution. The only right to vote were negative protections that had to be fought for through the amendment process. So afterwards, states may not deny the vote based on race, 15th Amendment, based on sex, 19th Amendment, and based on your status as an 18 to 20-year-old, the 26th Amendment. Now, while the 15th Amendment regarding race was passed in 1870, black voters faced deadly violence almost immediately. Many voting activists were killed in our history, and I'm going to focus on three today a little bit: Octavius Catto, Herbert Lee, and Vernon Dahmer. Now, even today, voting is a life and death matter. It's hard for black and brown citizens and many other marginalized groups to demand equity in education, employment, housing, and healthcare because they're denied to vote. And that lowers life expectancy. It wasn't until 1965 that the federal government affirmatively protected the right to vote thanks to the Voting Rights Act. Still, that right is far from guaranteed. So today I'm going to urge us all to honor those who paid for the vote with their blood by making certain that everybody has access to the ballot. I'm going to start by looking at the impact on black Americans of recent resurgence of voter repression. Back in 2000, the Supreme Court, in the ruling of Bush v. Gore, said that the Constitution does not guarantee citizens the right to vote for president. In June of 2013, the court effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act in the ruling Shelby County versus Holder. It wrote, according to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a dissenting justice, it wrote that the ruling absurdly eliminated voting protections because the protections were so effective. She said that it was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. She predicted that massive voter repression would ensue, and it has, particularly in the South. The very day the Shelby ruling was issued, the same day, Texas enacted the most stringent voter identification law in the nation. Arizona and Georgia quickly followed suit. Many new restrictions were imposed. Shelby also created great uncertainty as to what the rules were, and that led to an explosion of litigation. So the courts are stocked with these challenges, and while that's occurring, more restrictions are being passed. Challenges are occurring, but in particular, black people are being denied their franchise. Now, this suppression has continued for the 2 decades since 2000, and in March 25th, 2021, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp signed a bill lowering the number of ballot drop boxes, increasing voter identification requirements for absentee ballots, allowing states to take over the local election boards, and authorizing the arrest of people giving water and food to those waiting in line to vote. The newly elected Georgia Senator Ralph Warnock delivered a powerful speech, one of his first ones on the floor of the Senate, denouncing, quote, "the massive and unabashed assault on voting rights, unlike anything we've seen since the Jim Crow era. This is Jim Crow in new clothes," end quote. In 2022, the Brennan Center for Justice reported on egregious voter violations throughout the country, but particularly in Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, and Michigan. It declared that voters of color consistently face longer wait times on election day, and mail-in ballots from black voters are rejected at a much higher rate than those of white voters, end quote. Now voter repression is violent. Guns have been waved in the faces of election volunteers. Earlier this year, somebody shot at an election office in Cuyahoga County, Ohio. Mysterious white powder has been sent to election officials. State election officials in Georgia, Maine, Michigan, and Missouri have been harassed through what's called swatting, which is when somebody calls 911 reporting a violent situation that doesn't exist, and suddenly the election officials have their house surrounded by a SWAT team. And violence has spilled over, obviously, into an assassination attempt on a presidential candidate. All this has led to violence prevention training for election workers, panic buttons at election offices, and more officers at the various polling places. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission is funding the purchase of badge readers, cameras, protective fencing. Bulletproof glass was recently installed at some election offices. In one North Carolina election mail room, they installed a separate exhaust system to deal with the potential hazardous substances being sent to them. Being an election worker is more and more dangerous. Now, that kind of danger is something that many black voters have braved for generations. So I want to now turn the clock back and talk about the price paid by some black voting rights activists. Many of you know one of the most courageous, Octavius Catto. He was born free in 1839 in Charleston, South Carolina, moved up to Philadelphia, and unlike many black families at the time, his family had the resources to give him a first-rate education. So he enrolled in the Institute for Colored Youth here in Philadelphia, graduating in 1858. His principal praised him for outstanding scholarly work, great energy, and perseverance in school matters, end quote. He was elected the recording secretary of the Banneker Institute. He was hired to teach at ICU. His reputation got him elected secretary of the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League at a very young age. Now, Catto courageously spoke out about many forms of injustice. For example, he gave the ICU commencement address in 1864, and he critiqued the insensitivity of some white teachers regarding the needs of African American students. He called out the, quote, blind and ignorant prejudice that allowed black students to be taught by incompetent white teachers. That's a brave man. The next year at the Philadelphia National Hall, he praised the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. And inspired by the transformational potential of the Northern victory, Catto joined with Frederick Douglass in recruiting black citizens to serve in the Union Army. 2 weeks after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Catto gave a speech at Independence Hall, linking the patriotic sacrifice of black soldiers to the just, full reward of an enfranchised citizenship. He demanded the vote for that. A newspaper, the Christian Recorder, said that Catto, quote, paid a tribute to 200,000 blacks who, in spite of the verbal abuse and old bane of prejudice, have been nobly fighting battles, trusting to a redeemed country for the full recognition of their manhood in the future. It continued saying, de Tocqueville prophesied that if America ever underwent revolution, it would be brought about by the presence of the black race, and that it would be the result of the inequality of their condition. End quote. Now, Reconstruction offered a chance for that revolution, for a revival of democracy through full participation of black Americans. And for a brief couple of years, that appeared that our nation was going to transform into a more representative democracy. But backlash built in the form of the Ku Klux Klan, voter repression, and murder. So in Philadelphia, on October 10th of 1871, which was Election Day, tensions were high. Many white Democrats refused to accept black citizens voting for Republican candidates, and violence broke out. Dozens were injured. One black man was murdered with a hatchet blow to his skull. City police were called to quell the violence, but instead they used their power to keep black voters from the polls. In fact, one lieutenant was later arrested for having encouraged the police under his command to keep African Americans from voting. Now, despite the citywide violence, Catto strode out of his residence and went to vote. He was harassed by whites on the streets, and then at 9th and Vine Street, Frank Kelly shot Catto 3 times. He soon died of his wounds, and Kelly was never indicted. The New National Era, a Washington newspaper edited by Frederick Douglass, called Catto a martyr. Quote, "His death shall not have been in vain if it rouses the people of this city and the country of a more earnest determination to protect citizens of every class and color in the exercise of the citizen's most sacred right, the right to vote as his conscience directs him." Now, the mobs in Philadelphia that day were not the first. In Opelousas, Louisiana, 2 weeks in September of 1868, armed white men rampaged through black neighborhoods, killing more than 200 black citizens because they wanted to stop the black vote. C.E. Durand, an editor of the Republican-leaning newspaper, the St. Laundry Progress, was murdered and his body was hung outside a local drugstore as a threat to anybody wanting to vote. In 1873, in the town of Colfax, Louisiana, 150 armed white men killed between 60 and 150 black Americans, being held prisoner for the, quote, crime of supporting a Republican candidate for governor. In 1898, on November 9th, in Wilmington, North Carolina, Alfred Waddell led an armed mob of 60 people, an angry mob that killed 60 black citizens, and he declared afterwards, quote, "We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin." Now, that violence and the racism did not deter the educator, anti-lynching organizer, and voting activist, Mary McLeod Bethune. In 1912, she was denied a place in the suffrage movement due to racism, so she joined the Equal Suffrage League, which was an offshoot of the National Association of Colored Women. And she did a number of things to help black people vote in this country. She raised money to pay for the poll taxes that were selectively forced onto black people. She also did nighttime seminars to teach people how to read so they could pass the literacy tests that were also given primarily only to black voters. When 80 Klan members threatened her and threatened to burn down her school, Bethune held an all-night vigil with her students on the front lawn of her school. The Klan did back down, and Bethune then led 100 black voters in a march to the polls to vote for the first time. Generations of work by Bethune is an incredible testament to her strength. In 1939, 4 decades later, she explained how black Americans represented the best of our system of government. Quote, "Democracy is for me and for 12 million black Americans a goal towards which our nation is marching. It is a dream and an ideal in whose ultimate realization we have a deep and abiding faith. We have always been loyal when the ideals of American democracy have been attacked. We have given our blood in its defense, from Crispus Attucks on the Boston Commons to the battlefields of France. We have fought for democracy principles of equality under the law, equality of opportunity, equality of the ballot box, for the guarantees of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have fought to preserve one nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Yes, we have fought for America with all her imperfections, not so much for what she is, but for what we know she can be." That type of idealism surged 50 years later when the modern civil rights movement began. It inspired Herbert Lee, who had labored to build up his Mississippi cotton and dairy farm to support his wife and his 9 kids. As he entered the 5th decade of his life, despite threats and harassment, he would attend NAACP meetings. When Robert Moses of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee came down to register black voters in 1961, Lee volunteered to be his aide and his chauffeur. Incensed that black people were registering to vote, Billy Ray Cranston, who was a cousin of the local sheriff, attacked Moses with a knife. Moses survived, but Billy Ray Kasten's son-in-law, E.H. Hearst, who was Lee's neighbor growing up and his childhood friend, decided that Lee would now pay for being an aide to Robert Moses. So on September 25th of 1961, Hearst, who had become a state representative, mind you, he was a state representative in the government, approached Lee as he was registering black voters. He shouted angrily and shot Lee in the head. One witness to the crime was soon after killed. Hearst claimed self-defense and was cleared by an all-white jury. Moses fled the county. Now, despite such violence, and many people didn't know of those incidences, they knew very well of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, but that type of violence continued, and it eventually prompted the Voting Rights Act of '65 to be passed. And that law only provided reason for more backlash. So now that brings me to Vernon F. Dahmer, Sr. January 10th, 1966, he was serving as president of the NAACP chapter in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. His house was surrounded by Klansmen. Shots riddled the Dahmer house. Vernon grabbed his shotgun to protect his wife and children, allowing them to escape. But the Klan set his house on fire. Vernon was burnt from the waist up and got scorched lungs. Days later, as he lay dying, a local newspaper reporter asked him if voting was important enough to die for. Dahmer said, "If you don't vote, you don't count." There's a short documentary I'll be showing tomorrow at 5:30 called Dying to Vote that is about the story of Vernon Dahmer. I want to just take a moment to take a breath and to keep in our mind those who fought for the right to vote and paid for it with their lives. If you don't vote, you don't count. Ethical culturists want everybody to count. It's why we commit to treat every person as being of inherent, infinite, and unique worth. Well, in a democracy, that commitment means assuring that everybody can vote. In this way, voting is a secular but sacred act, I would say. It's reflected in the comments of ethical culture leader John Lovejoy Elliott. My leader, colleague Bob Burson, up in northern Westchester, shared with me these words from Elliott. The democratized view of the divine is what the ethical movement is trying to see, trying to move towards, and to help realize. Democracy and our religious faith are much one and the same thing. To make democracy work is our religious task. Well, whether you call democracy a religious task or a civic duty or whatever, I think we can agree it's of profound importance, now more than ever. George Adele, who worked in the AAU office, our federating organization, for 30 years, said it well. He said, democracy is something more than the pulling of a lever in a polling booth. It means the appeal to think in social terms, to belong consciously in a community, to share intelligence with others, to do one's work in the world so as to enhance the working power and achievement of others, to recognize that class barriers and economic distinctions are an insult to the human soul, and that in all persons there is the possibility of decency. Now, I know it's challenging to honor the decency of every person, especially when we're in a bruising political campaign where our opponents might attack us or mock us. It's hard to retain a positive vision at this time when there's so much economic insecurity, climate, fear, terrorism. But we need to. We need to resist the fact that fear breeds tribalism. Fear breeds tribalism. Howard Radis, who was an ethical culture leader, wrote an article a few years ago called Democracy in a Time of Terror. And he reminds us that our ideals need to fuel an expansion of the democratic spirit. He wrote, democratic values, integrity of persons, truthfulness between persons, hopefulness from persons, must endure beyond wealth and strength. It is these values that together make democracy not merely a political arrangement, but a mode of living. The philosopher Alain Locke said something similar. He said, if we're going to have effective democracy in America, we must have the democratic spirit as well as the democratic tradition. Now that spirit must move every citizen to accept responsibility for democracy. We can't just pass off this responsibility to a strong man who claims to act in our interests. If government's going to represent the will of the people, truly it can't be hijacked by authoritarian bullies. When Napoleon claimed l'État c'est moi, the state is me, he was trying to convince everyday people who were suffering that he would represent them. They believed him and he became a dictator. Fascists used the same playbook. Hitler and Mussolini convinced enough people to live vicariously through their anger and power. But the only way the will of the people is really expressed is through democracy from the ground up. That was part of the meaning of Walt Whitman's Blades of Grass. This was a lifelong project that celebrated nature and the sensuality of humans, but it also was about the sacredness of empowerment of the common people. Whitman's faith in democracy came from faith in everyday people. He saw in the farmer and the laborer a natural resilience and strength, and he saw everyday people as these blades of grass growing from the soil. During World War II, the government actually distributed copies of Blades of Grass to the soldiers to inspire them to defend democracy. Whitman pointed out that it was the diversity in Americans that was important. He said, we are all light-skinned and dark-hued, everyday people and distinguished state persons, blades of grass, nothing more, nothing less. David Brooks, the columnist, pointed this poem out and said that Whitman wanted to spiritualize democratic life. For Whitman, every blade of grass is sacred. They each are individuals and they fill our common garden. Out of one, out of many, out of our nation, the unity comes from our diversity. Langston Hughes praised Whitman in a 1946 anthology that had Blades of Grass. He wrote that Whitman's, quote, all-embracing words lock arms with workers and farmers, Negroes and whites, Asiatics and Europeans, serfs and freemen, beaming democracy to all, end quote. Now, Hughes had long acknowledged the problems facing democracy. When he was a young man in 1922, he wrote one of his most famous poems. It goes like this: democracy will not come today, this year, nor ever through compromise and fear. I have as much right as the other fellow has to stand on my 2 feet and own the land. I tire so of hearing people say, let things take their course, tomorrow is another day. I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. Freedom is a strong seed planted in a great need. I live here too. I want freedom just as you. For so many marginalized Americans, it takes persistence mixed with faith and hope and light to tend this democratic garden. I mean, Cornel West, who was well aware of the history of domination, still believes in democracy. He said, democracy is the hearing and heeding of the voices of the victims of hierarchies that have been in place, that have been dominating and exploiting people. A decade ago, Jocelyn Stewart wrote an article in Time magazine titled, People Died So I Could Vote. She pointed out how many black people, particularly in the South, often hesitate to do what I do after I vote. I take that little red, white, and blue sticker and I put it on my shirt. It says, I voted. But she writes about many black people she knows who hesitate to do that. They hesitate because they realize that that sticker could put their life in danger. Stewart said, the admirable persistence of her ancestors inspires her, though. She said, our democracy demanded a double portion of faith from older African Americans. It required them to believe the rights accorded to citizens of this nation, even as that nation denied the same rights to people of color. It required them to march, sit in, stand up, and face police dogs and water hoses until America was forced to do what Martin Luther King Jr. said, rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, to maintain that double portion of faith, many call forth the courage and leadership of the fallen heroes I touched on today, of Catto and Lee and Dahmer. The lessons they taught, the inspiration they offer, must infuse the work we do today. That's certainly the opinion of Philadelphia's indomitable Michael Cord. He reminds us that democracy must be continually rebuilt and reinvigorated, that this work is done better when we remember democratic heroes. They can't be forgotten. And until that statue of Catto was erected, he was known as the forgotten hero. He's buried at the historic Eden Cemetery in West Philadelphia, but we need to remember his spirit today. Cord urges us, in fact, to remember the many and contribute to and honor the organizations that have Catto in their name, and there are many. I'll share them on the listserv. One I'll mention is the O.V. Catto Initiative. It was created by Joe Certain, who did so much to defend voting rights today before he died last year. I agree with Certain when he said, mainstream historians would have us believe that Catto's advocacy and activism died when he was murdered. We say that Catto initiated a voting rights movement that included Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Viola Liuzzo, Malcolm X, and many other activists who have made the ultimate sacrifice. The spirit of Catto motivates us, inspires all of us who continue his work. He leads us forward like the pillar of fire through the darkness of fear and intimidation that would serve to keep us lesser than who we truly are. End quote. The spirit of Catto certainly inspires the amazing Mark Kelly down at Mother Bethel. He has written about Catto's sacrifice and how it remains a call to action today. I would think that the spirit of Catto infuses the Legal Defense Fund and their interdisciplinary initiative, Black Voters on the Rise. This is an initiative that they go to historically black colleges and universities where they monitor and respond to voter repression tactics. And maybe it inspires many voting integrity groups that I urge you to check out and support, not just now, but after this election. This is the problem, it's not going away. Organizations like the Brennan Center, Fair Vote, Common Cause, Democracy Works, Inc., Vote Riders, Voter Participation Center, the ACLU, and the Legal Defense Fund. I'll send those all out on the listserv. And maybe the spirit of Catto filled the 115 high school students who 10 days after the murder of Herbert Lee marched through Macomb, Mississippi. Maybe it inspired Vernon Dahmer, whose bravery is documented in the film that we'll see tomorrow, Dying to Vote. It certainly inspired one person in that documentary, Representative Benny Thompson, who was the chair of the January 6th Commission. On January 6th of 2021, he was told by police officers to take the pin off his lapel that indicated that he was a congressperson for his own safety. He appreciated, this is his words, that, quote, the pin that once was a badge of honor and distinction had turned into a bullseye. But, remembering those who died to secure the vote for all Americans, he refused to take it off. Now that's the spirit of Catto. When I was growing up, it was a given that democracy would spread to all corners of the globe. And when the Cold War ended, it seemed that it would grow stronger and stronger every day. Today, that democracy is being challenged. So I urge you to tap the spirit of Catto and all those who died to vote. Find your own way to assure that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people doesn't perish from this earth.